At some point next week, a Boeing 787 will take off on one of the most isolated routes on the planet, connecting an archipelago in the middle of the Pacific to Los Angeles, Paris, and Tokyo. If that aircraft experiences a serious technical problem, the airline operating it instantly loses 25% of its entire international capacity. There is no spare aircraft. There is no Plan B. Most airlines around the world would never agree to operate under those conditions, but Air Tahiti Nui had no choice, and the decision that put it in that position, betting everything on just a handful of 787s while the company was emerging from the brink of bankruptcy, may be one of the strongest examples of how Boeing permanently changed the equation of commercial aviation. French Polynesia is a collection of islands scattered across the South Pacific, thousands of kilometers from any inhabited continent. There is no nearby neighbor, there is no land route, there is nothing except an immense expanse of ocean. Everything that enters or leaves the territory, whether passengers or cargo, travels by aircraft or by ship. The population is small. The domestic aviation market is practically non-existent outside the inter-island connections, which are operated by much smaller aircraft. And the economy depends in a structural way on international tourism to a degree that very few territories in the world can replicate. The question that naturally arises is, how can an international airline survive while operating from such a small market, so isolated and so dependent on a single sector of the economy? The answer lies in the airline's very origin. Air Tahiti Nui was founded on October 31, 1996, and began operations on November 20, 1998, becoming the first long-haul airline based in French Polynesia, created specifically to develop inbound tourism to the territory. The government of French Polynesia remains the majority shareholder, owning 84.4% of the company alongside local investors. This airline was never created simply to sell airline tickets. It was created to attract tourists, strengthen the local economy, reduce the territory's dependence on foreign airlines for its international connections, and give French Polynesia greater control over its own access to the rest of the world. Above all else, it was a national economic instrument, and that explains virtually every strategic decision that followed, including decisions that, when viewed in isolation, would seem counterintuitive to any traditional airline. Today, Air Tahiti Nui flies to destinations such as Los Angeles, Paris via Los Angeles, Tokyo, Auckland, and Seattle, with codeshare agreements extending that network to another 39 cities around the world. The route between Papeete and Paris via Los Angeles has even been classified as the longest domestic route on the planet. After all, French Polynesia is technically French territory, making this a domestic flight of nearly 19 hours to the French capital. The airline started small, a single Airbus A340-200 operating flights to Los Angeles and Paris. In 2002, two A340-300s joined the fleet. In December of that same year, the fleet doubled to 4 A340-300s, allowing the airline to expand its key Papeete-Los Angeles-Paris route. In June 2005, the fifth A340-300 arrived, and the airline transitioned to operating that fleet exclusively, which at the time was described as one of the youngest A340 fleets in the world. In the 90s and the early 2000s, the A340 was not simply another option, it was practically the only sensible choice for this type of operation.
At that time, ETOPS certifications, which regulate how long a twin-engined aircraft may fly away from a suitable diversion airport over the ocean, still imposed significant limitations on long-haul operations across the Pacific. The A340, with its 4 engines, was not subject to those restrictions in the same way. That gave Air Tahiti Nui something that no twin-engined aircraft of that era could offer with the same margin of safety: range and operational confidence for extremely remote routes across one of the largest expanses of open ocean on Earth, where an emergency diversion could still mean hours before reaching the nearest airport. Add to that an aircraft capacity perfectly suited to the airline's actual market size, and the A340 appeared to be, quite literally, the perfect aircraft for the problem Air Tahiti Nui needed to solve. For almost 2 decades, that is exactly what it did. But the world surrounding that aircraft did not stop changing. While Air Tahiti Nui continued operating its fleet of 5 A340-300s, the commercial aviation industry was being completely transformed. Fuel became structurally more expensive. Twin-engined aircraft became dramatically more efficient. ETOPS certifications evolved to the point of virtually eliminating the advantage that had once justified 4-engine aircraft on long overwater routes. Boeing introduced the 777 with performance that made the A340 increasingly expensive to operate on a per-seat basis. Then came the 787 Dreamliner, an aircraft built around an entirely new philosophy of efficiency, one that the A340 simply had no way of matching. The very aircraft that during the 90s had been the only viable option for Air Tahiti Nui eventually became one of the reasons why the airline almost failed to survive. After years of operating at a deficit, Air Tahiti Nui came close to bankruptcy in 2011. The then president of French Polynesia, Oscar Timaru, even asked eligible workers throughout the territory to voluntarily contribute part of their income to a rescue fund for the airline. Then, the most sensible question began to be asked: could Air Tahiti Nui survive while continuing to operate this fleet? The restructuring that followed the near collapse of 2011 was not quick. The airline spent years making financial and operational adjustments before any sign of recovery began to appear in its financial results. Along the way, entire routes were reassessed. In 2009, the airline discontinued its direct flights between French Polynesia and Sydney, and in 2010, it also withdrew from New York. Painful cuts, but ones that reduced its exposure. The restructuring began to produce more consistent results starting in 2015, when the airline returned to profitability after 4 consecutive years of losses. The 5th consecutive year of positive results came shortly afterward, with the company reporting total revenue of 298 million euros and a net profit after taxes of 18.8 million euros in 2016. It was precisely during this period of recovery, still recent, still fragile, that Air Tahiti Nui made the riskiest decision in its history. In May 2015, it announced the complete replacement of its fleet of 5 A340-300s with 4 Boeing 787-9 Dreamliners.
For most airlines around the world, replacing an entire fleet is a gradual process. For Air Tahiti Nui, it was completely different. Renewing its entire fleet meant committing virtually the entire future of the company all at once. It involved an investment of hundreds of millions of dollars. It involved completely retraining pilots and cabin crews for an aircraft built around an entirely new operating philosophy, from its electronic systems to the way the aircraft responds in flight. It involved adapting the entire maintenance structure, as well as financing and leasing contracts. If the project failed, there would be no plan B. Everything would be compromised. The technical comparison explains why this gamble, despite the risks, was almost inevitable. While the A340 operated with 4 engines and had very high fuel consumption by the standards of its time, its maintenance was also becoming increasingly expensive and complex. Everything on the A340 was larger: engines, landing gear, tires, overall size. The costs scaled upward in every direction, and the result was astronomical. The 787-9, on the other hand, introduced a fuselage made primarily of composite materials, which reduced wear caused by marine salt exposure. It used far more efficient twin engines, had a lower cost per seat, comparable or even superior range, and a structurally simpler maintenance system. The difference was not small. This was not a preference for one manufacturer over another, it was a structural necessity. The aircraft that had made the airline's mission possible in the 90s was no longer capable of sustaining that same mission 2 decades later. The first 787-9s entered the fleet in October 2018, the same year the airline celebrated 20 years of operations, a symbolic coincidence between the celebration of its past and the commitment to its future. The last A340s continued flying until September 2019, when the transition was completed. It's easy to assume that the Dreamliner alone saved Air Tahiti Nui, but that is not the full explanation. Air Tahiti Nui never attempted to compete directly with Emirates, Singapore Airlines, or Air France in terms of scale. It deliberately chose a different path: few routes, high load factors, a focus on premium tourism, an extremely lean operation, and a fully standardized fleet, today consisting exclusively of Boeing 787-9s, which radically simplifies training, spare parts, and maintenance logistics. To contextualize Air Tahiti Nui's efficiency, its load factor is 73%. It is not the highest number among the largest airlines, but remember, we're talking about just 4 aircraft operating flights lasting between 8 and 12 hours. Air Tahiti Nui's choice is to serve a deliberately smaller, exclusive market, because the territory simply doesn't have the physical, social, or environmental capacity to support anything else. Growing too much would not be a victory, it would destroy exactly what makes the destination valuable.
It was precisely this discipline that allowed the airline to fully capture the real advantages of the 787 instead of simply replacing aircraft and expecting that to solve everything on its own. This choice to operate small has an effect that is rarely discussed. When a large airline loses an aircraft to maintenance, it simply redistributes operations. The passenger almost never notices. Air Tahiti Nui does not have that margin. With only 4 Boeing 787-9s, the unavailability of a single aircraft can instantly reduce up to 25% of the airline's operational capacity. This forces a chain reaction: passenger rebooking, agreements with other airlines, and in some cases even short-term aircraft leasing to keep the network operating between destinations such as Los Angeles, Tokyo, and Paris. This is not a theoretical scenario, it is a structural limitation. And yet, the airline continues to operate. The Boeing 787 did bring lower fuel consumption, higher operational efficiency, and a better passenger experience, but none of that alone would have guaranteed Air Tahiti Nui's survival. The airline continued to exist because it maintained an extremely disciplined operation, carefully selected where to fly, took advantage of high-value international tourism, and avoided expanding beyond what its home market could realistically sustain, even when the temptation to expand with a new and more efficient aircraft certainly existed. The airline did not grow beyond what the market could support. It did not try to compete with giants. It did not expand its network beyond what was necessary. It remained exactly at the point where existence was still possible. For a long time, it seemed that the story of Air Tahiti Nui was about choosing between Airbus and Boeing, but that was never the real decision. The A340 allowed a tiny airline to connect one of the most isolated places on Earth to the rest of the world at a time when no other aircraft could have done it with the same level of safety. The 787 made that mission economically viable in a new reality of costs and efficiency when the world no longer allowed operations as they were in the 90s. Still, neither aircraft alone would have been enough without a rare strategy in modern aviation, growing only to the point where continued existence was still possible. The Boeing 787 simply updated that equation to a new cost reality. The real deciding factor was never the aircraft, it was the ability to not grow beyond what the ocean itself can sustain.